Hello Hellions, welcome to another lecture on the history of the English language. Today's subject is Middle English 3, but we are still talking about changes that happened in late Old English. That's right, William the Conqueror and his buddies from Normandy and northern France have not yet arrived to begin turning Old English into Middle English, but some critical changes are still happening in late Old English which distinguish it in sound and form and meaning from Middle English, which is much more familiar to the modern ear. Let's review some important features of Old English. We said that Old English was a highly inflected language, and that the inflections consist of verb conjugations, which would be verb endings for I, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, they, as well as noun endings, as well as articles, for case, which tell the noun's role in the sentence. And we looked at Old English verb conjugation, noting that for each person, each I, thu, you, or thou, he, heo, hit, he, she, and it, we, ye, and he, we, y'all, and they, there's a particular ending. So if we take the verb daemon, we're going to remove the an, which is an infinitive ending, exactly like en in modern German, and we're going to add the person ending. So if I want to say I judge, as in deem, that would be each dema. You deem would be, you judge would be thu demest. He, she, or it judges would be he, he, or hit demeth. And the plurals are all the same, we demoth, ye demoth, and he demoth. All of these endings are falling off or eroding away by the end of the Old English period, but some of them do hang around for quite a while. You'll recognize the thu demest form from the 17th century, as late as Shakespeare, thou goest. That's one of the latest to hold on. And it's verb forms like these that explain strange signs like this. Mass cancelled, go drinketh beer, dunketh thy worms into the river. I love how thee has an extra E because it's become the thee as in thou and thee, when in fact it was just the article thee. Fun, church. Before moving on to nouns, let's have a little bit of fun with verb endings, and with my favorite verb, begrindan. Back when I was an undergraduate physics major, taking Old English from this man, Hans Arsleff, who looked like a Norwegian sailor who'd just gotten off a yawl and started speaking Old English to us. My roommate Charles and I were looking through our Bright's Old English textbook, thumbing through the glossary, and we noticed how many words there were for to kill. And our very favorite was begrindan, to kill. That's right, by grinding, a word which must have come up quite often. It's interesting to think of a culture in which you would need to reach for that word so often. So let's practice killing people by grinding. I kill by grinding. Ich begrinda, thu begrindeth, he heo hit begrindeth, we begrindath, ye begrindath, he begrindath, everybody begrindath. Thank you. That was fun. Moving on to nouns, what conjugations are to verbs, declensions are to nouns. And if you've had Latin or Greek or Sanskrit, you're very familiar with this. Nouns have endings as well as article forms which tell their role in a sentence. There's nominative, which says, hello, I'm doing the action of the verb. There's dropping down to accusative, which says I'm receiving the action of the verb. The verb is happening to me. There's dative, which is indirect object, a sort of beneficiary. The action is happening to or for me. And then there's genitive, which is possession. We noticed that there was stan and stanas, stanes and stana, stan and stanas, and stane and stanom. All of these endings, which we just don't have in modern English, which tells what role the noun plays, usually relative to the verb, in the sentence. All of those fell off. And before moving on to the why, let's just notice how completely they have fallen off in modern English, which has become an almost completely uninflected language. I kill by grinding, you kill by grinding, he, she, it kills. We kill, y'all kill, they kill. Not quite as fun, is it? The only ending which survived from Old English times till now is the S on he, she, or it. So you could actually say that we do have a conjugation in verb forms, and that really they're just two verb forms, the he, she, it form and the non-he, she, it form. Now let's take a look at nouns. Again, singular and plural categories. We don't really do anything to distinguish whether the noun is the subject, doing the killing by grinding, the direct object, being killed by grinding, or the indirect object, the beneficiary of the killing by grinding. We do, however, mark possessive. In speech, we mark it with an S sound, sometimes a Z sound. In writing, we mark it with an apostrophe and an S, the apostrophe on either side of the S, depending on singular or plural. And we mark plurals with an S. So looking at modern English nouns, you could really say that we only distinguish two functions. First is plural, and second is possessive. And confusingly, in speech at least, we distinguish both of them by adding the same letter, S, sometimes pronounced as Z. Thinking back to Old English inflections, what's the one sound that had the most staying power? Both in nouns and verbs, the one that refused to erode away as if it were some kind of denser, harder kind of rock that the waves of time could not erode away. In both nouns and verbs, this is pretty cool, it's S. This is the same sound that if you're a singer and you've been in a choir, at some point, I guarantee your choir director has said, less S, minimize the S's because they just cut through. That's the kind of power they have. We are now at the point where we can ask today's big question. Where did all the endings go? Especially if the French didn't come and take them. It's always a good idea to start by asking if Gru took them, with Dr. Nefario's help, not to mention all those minions. That's not actually the case. No, English did this all by itself. In late Old English, the language was busy becoming uninflected. It's in fact a sort of myth among people who know a little bit about this subject that 1066 led to the ending of endings in English, that the French came and they began chopping off the endings, that somehow the Anglo-Saxons were happy, mead-swilling mercenaries until the French arrived with their Chardonnay and mushrooms and cream sauce and took away all their noun and verb endings. Well, in fact, Mythbusters were on it. It's busted. Even before Middle English began, Old English was already losing its inflections. Why? The answer, in a word, stress or accent. A couple of facts. First of all, early Germanic developed this pattern of putting the stress, the emphasis, on the first syllable of most words. That's not always the case, by the way. Words that come from Latin, for instance, have what we call variable stress. That means that when you put different suffixes or prefixes on, the stress, the primary stress in the word, bounces around. Let's take the word pacify, to make peaceable. It comes from the Latin pax. If we start with just the word pacify, it has first syllable accent, pacify. But what if we change that to the name of the ocean to our west? Pacific. It's not Pacific Ocean, it's Pacific Ocean. And if we go another level and talk about, say, the pacification of, say, a warlike group, pacification, it's moved to the fourth syllable of the word. That's variable stress. But Germanic language developed stress on the first syllable. Why is that important? Think back to phonetics and our favorite sound right there in the middle of the vowel chart, the schwa. What happens to a vowel that is not in a stressed syllable? It goes from having full vowel qualities, being high or low, front or back, to just being in the middle of the mouth. And everybody, let's do the schwa together. So if early Germanic words, including Old English, stress the first syllable, and it's the endings which carry the inflections on an unaccented syllable, all those different vowels are going to get turned into they're going to get leveled out. Results. The unstressed endings all start to sound alike. They're A's and U's, Ah's and Oo's, but they all go to Uh's. We call this morphological leveling out where everything becomes the same. Those endings become meaningless. They don't serve a function. They're not interpretable, we could say. And when that happens, they tend to get dropped. So, in one word, why did English become an uninflected language? Stress! Whenever stress enters your life, interesting things happen, and that's the case with English. The results of the uninflecting of the English language is we get rid of grammatical gender. That idea that nouns have classes, that they are in some way masculine, feminine, and neuter. In German, for instance, spoons are boys, der Löffel, and forks are girls, die Gabel, and knives are neuter, das Messer. And those articles, those the words, der, die, and das, tell us that they have some kind of grammatical gender. And yes, that's the bane, the misery of students in German class. Spanish class has two genders. If grammatical gender is carried largely by the endings on nouns, and those endings go away, so does a lot of the basis for distinguishing the gender of nouns. So we can actually thank stress and its effect on the endings of nouns for English not having to worry about turnips being girls and girls being neuter, which is true in German. In terms of gender, all we have is biological gender, and only that in some of our pronouns, he, she, him, or her, and in certain jobs where we distinguish an actor from an actress. And we don't even do that quite so much anymore. Another result, the verb conjugation is simplified. You just have to remember third person singular and non-third person singular. Another result of uninflection is the rise of small grammatical words like prepositions. If English loses the ability in Old English for a word to say, hello, I will be your direct object, and I'm singular, or I'll be your indirect object, and I'm plural, because the endings have worn off, then we need to find another mechanism to tell what role a noun has relative to the verb. Think back to this line of Cadman, the second sentence. He cheop eordan bearnum. And focus on the endings on eordan bearnum. The meaning there is he first shaped, and then we have to go sort of backwards. For the sons of earth. In Old English, bearn means son, and that ending says, hello, I'll be your indirect object. In other words, I'll be the beneficiary of what is being done, the beneficiary of the shaping. That was done with an ending in the original, and in modern English, we do that not with an ending on the noun, but with a small word, a preposition, before the noun, for the sons. And then look at eordan. Eorth is the root word, and eordan, that an is actually a genitive of earth. And again, the function is gone from the end of the noun as a suffix to a preposition before it. So you could say that as English lost its inflections, it became more preposition-y. The last result of English becoming an uninflected language is that we now have to rely on word order. Whereas Old English could rely on little bits of code like an and um for a noun to tell us what its role was relative to the verb, today we have to look at where it falls in the sentence. Is it before the verb? Is it after the verb? That's how we tell if a noun is the subject or the object. Your standard declarative sentence in modern English goes SVO, subject, verb, object. That's why boy eats hot dog is not the same as hot dog eats boy. The reason we have to rely on word order is that words no longer come with bits of code telling us what their role is. Let's pause and consider the significance of word order. When Old English lost its inflectional endings, English went from belonging to one major category of languages to another major category of languages. It went from being an inflected language to a word order language. That's one way that linguists divide different languages of the world. And the best way to think of this, if you haven't studied a language like Latin, is what I call the blender test. If you have an inflected language, where every word has a little bit of code telling you its function, you can basically put that sentence into a blender and turn it on and scramble the order of the words, and whatever order they come back out in, your subject is still your subject, your direct object is still your direct object, no matter where it falls in the sentence. This is actually really cool if you're a poet, because then you're not constrained by things like word order. And if you want the indirect object or the direct object to come first in the sentence because of its sound or its meter, its rhythm, you can do that, and the word will mean the same thing no matter what order the words come in. Old English, in fact, developed some standard word orders to do some of the basic functions of a sentence. As I mentioned, SVO, subject, verb, object, says statement. You read the book. VSO, however, was question. Read you the book, where you start with the verb, read, and then the subject, you doing the reading, and end with the object, the thing read. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that's not how we say that. It's not been how we say that for the last 300 or so years, because we have do. Now we ask questions with do. Do you read the book? Or we might say, are you reading the book? But late Old English and Middle English had much easier ways of forming a question. Read you the book? And in fact, German still has exactly that way of forming a question. Liest du das Buch? Read you the book. No do, no ing. Interestingly, as Old English shifted from being an inflected or blender language to a word order language, it had another word order that we're probably completely unfamiliar with, the subject-object verb. This was used for commands. Its form would be something like, I you beseech. To beseech is to beg or to plead. And there's one more, the SUV, which is a large vehicle for transporting children, as in the sentence, I'm late for soccer practice. No, not really. So far, I've told you a lot about how our language became uninflected, and I've told you about the significance of it becoming uninflected, but I've not yet shown you it becoming uninflected. And in fact, for my next trick, I'd like to show you that transformation actually happened. And in order to do that, I would like to present the amazing Peterborough Chronicle. Peterborough is a city still in southeast England, and a chronicle is a kind of history book. But it's a very formulaic history book. It's really more like a diary. Cities have them, monasteries have them, and they contain really simple entries of what happened this year or what happened this month. There was an Anglo-Saxon chronicle, if you'll recall, which we read from back when we were looking at the Germanic Anglo-Saxons overrunning the native Celtic Britons. Well, this is the Peterborough Chronicle from a later period of time, and this chronicle is a treasure trove of linguistic evidence. It has amazing documentation of the very changes we've been talking about in late Old English. The main thing that makes the Peterborough Chronicle such amazing linguistic evidence is the literacy level of the scribes, of the people who wrote the chronicle. It was high enough to record speech accurately, meaning they were educated enough to write down phonetically the way they heard people in their time talking. The scribe's education level was also low enough that if language changed, they would not simply ignore the change in favor of a standardized form, which had, for instance, been common when they were younger. So these scribes are recording pretty accurately how people talk in their time. The second thing that makes the Peterborough Chronicle such a find for linguists is that, as I said, it's a very simplified history. In fact, every entry, and there's entry for every year, starts with some pretty standardized language. And so we can compare changes in standardized formulas year by year. The next thing that makes the Peterborough Chronicle such amazing linguistic evidence is that it was kept continuously in a crucial historical period from 997, that's about 3 or 4 generations before 1066, until 1154, that's about 3 or 4 generations after 1066. And so it provides a record of what was happening in the language as the biggest thing that ever happened to English happened to it. 1066, when the French arrived, is sort of like the meteorite that we think hit the Earth that wiped out the dinosaurs. It changed the entire ecosystem of the Earth. Well, the French changed the entire system of the English language, and we get to watch it through the year-by-year entries in the Peterborough Chronicle most of which begin with the phrase in this year. So what we're going to do now is take a look at the phrase in this year as it was written in different years. Here we can see one of the entries in manuscript form. You see on, thissom with a thorn at the beginning and long s's, and yer. The first entry we're going to look at is from 1083. Yes, that's 17 years after the Norman invasion in 1066, but massive changes in the structure of a language don't happen quickly. They take generations. So this is still, even though it's post-1066, we could consider this late Old English. And the phrase we're going to examine is on thissom yer. The G would be fronted by the front vowel E, A. The Old English endings in this phrase are perfectly intact. There's the UM, exactly as in bearnum, and yer has an E on the end. Both indicate several things. That year is a masculine noun, because we still have grammatical gender, that it's singular, and that it's dative, in this case because it's the object of the preposition on. That's not especially important. Just note that there's a lot of specific information encoded in those words endings. Those would have meant something to people hearing that or writing that in 1083. The fact that people are still speaking and writing perfect Old English 17 years after the Norman Conquest reminds us that people didn't just wake up one morning speaking Middle English. Let's fast forward in time to 1117. Our entry now is on thisson yer. And this on appears to be misspelled. Remember what it came from, thissom. In the 34 years since the previous entry, we probably have a new scribe, a new generation of scribes in the monastery, and they write on where we had um before. And we think to ourselves, is this misspelled? Is the writer uneducated? Probably not. He's probably recording, and it probably would have been a he, accurately the way people spoke in his generation. The important thing to note is that this scribe feels the need to record an ending on this, and it's not an ending that is randomly different from the previous, from um to on. From u to o, those are both back vowels, oo, o, ah, right? So there's a back vowel, and m to n, that also is not a random change from to If you make the sounds, you can probably remember your phonetics even better. Those are both nasal consonants. So this 34 years has brought change, but not indiscriminate or random change. This still would have been meaningful. And of course, yer still has the ending e. Let's now fast forward 18 years, maybe one more generation, or maybe the last scribe is still writing but is an old man now. In 1135, we have the phrase on this yer. This has now lost its entire inflectional ending. What that means is that gender agreement is now gone. It's as if the word year is no longer masculine. In fact, it has no grammatical gender at all. It's also likely that since the original and then the on of the last generation, all of the vowels had become schwa-ified, had become a kind of maybe with a bit of nasality after it. And for a new generation, these sounds might have become meaningless, something their parents did, but that had no significance for them. And what do we do with things that have no meaning to us anymore? We toss them. So they've tossed the ending for this. The noun, yer, still contains its e, but I'm guessing that it was just left there out of habit. It's a fossil. It's vestigial. Vestigial means that it's still there out of habit and tradition, but it's not performing any role anymore. We would say it is uninterpreted. Let's make one more jump in time, again 19 years ahead, maybe another generation. In 1154, we have on this yer. That e, which was meaningless, was dropped over that generation. The noun is now completely uninflected, no endings on this or year, no biological gender, no nouns announcing their case role. There's no processing of masculine or dative. English is now a fully uninflected language. And if you replace that thorn with a th and that g with a y, you have modern English. This was an enormous shift in the language, and you've just seen it before your eyes, year to year, over about 70 years. Think about what we have just witnessed. In 70 years, 2 generations, 3 generations, we have a situation where if the original author is still alive, and that's the granddad or the great-granddad, and the author of the last entry is maybe an 18-year-old, you have a situation where great-grandpa is speaking an inflected language, Old English, and the great-grandson is speaking a word order language, which is uninflected, without biological gender, without noun cases. And though they likely could have understood each other, the language had moved so far in 3 generations that it had changed categories in the world's languages. That amount of change in one lifespan, 70 years, probably seems extraordinary to us, but historical linguists will tell you this is actually closer to what is historically normal for the world's languages. In the absence of mass media, like the internet, or even the telegraph, or writing and printing, in the absence of standardization and nation formation over the last several hundred years, this is how quickly the world's languages move. Most of them still do it today, though fewer and fewer. And English used to move this quickly as well. Before we leave Old English behind, I want to point out some sound changes that were happening. So far we've been looking at grammatical changes, or morphological changes. Now I just want to look at some phonetic changes, some sounds that were becoming simplified. And you will recognize in most of these changes an unfamiliar and possibly unpronounceable Old English form turning into a form that is much more like the one you're familiar with. By far the most significant change that happened to sounds in late Old English was that words that began with consonant clusters had those beginnings simplified. Very common is the loss of the initial H. We don't do this in modern English, but Old English loved to combine initial H sounds with other consonants. Some of these are kind of entertaining. The Old English word for to laugh began with HL. We don't begin words with HL today. But it would have sounded like, keeping in mind that medial H, the H in the middle of a word, goes ch. That means the Old English word for to laugh, and I'm going to get good and said and try and perform this one for you, would be something like chleachian, which if you think about it, sounds a little bit like laughing. You might be laughing right now. Chleachian. If you take the sound that a horse makes to neigh, that also began with an H, HN, and that would be chnachian. These are practically onomatopoeia. They are almost onomatopoetic. Words like buzz that sound like the thing they represent. The horse goes chnachian. Even the word ring would have started with an H, ring, whereas today we just have ring. Another simplification is the FN beginning, which again we do not do in modern English. It was turning into SN. F and S are both fricatives, and they're both in the front of the mouth, and S. So it's a little bit of a shift of which fricative comes before N's. But this renders some unfamiliar words rather familiar. To sneeze in Old English was fnastion, which sounds marvelous. The next time you sneeze, fnastion. Sounds a little nasty and like stuff's coming out of your nose, doesn't it? Again, an animal sound. To snort is fnortion. Fnastion becomes sneeze, and fnortion becomes snort. Another initial consonant cluster, HW, becomes our WH. And that's familiar from the Old English word for what becomes what. What. That's the first word you remember of Beowulf. What we gardena. And I said it means something like, put down your meat horns and listen up, I've got a story to tell. To illustrate this simplification of initial consonants, I want to tell you a word story. And the word story starts with a question. In a medieval castle, if you think back to feudal times in the Middle Ages, why aren't the male and female heads of the castle called master and dame? In fact, that's what they're called in several other languages. German has Meister and Dame. Cognates of these two words exist in a lot of Indo-European languages. French has maîtresse and dame. Italian has maestro, which we've borrowed into English as usually the celebrated conductor of an orchestra, and donna. Latin, which the French and Italian come from, has magister and domina. Polish has those two words. Yes, Kensak is Polish, but I do not speak the Polish, so I will not attempt to pronounce it. Romanian, another Italic language, has maestro and doamna. Even Latvian, way up north in Europe, Latvia and Lithuania, the two Baltic Indo-European languages, have maistars and dam. You'll probably recognize some of these words because we have borrowed so many of them into English. We do have versions of these words. We have master, usually a master and a slave, or someone who has mastered a field or has an MA degree, who has achieved mastery and can act masterfully, and maybe create masterpieces. Master is actually the origin of our word mister, and it's the origin of the French maître d'hôtel, the master of the hotel, which we abbreviate as maître d'. On the other hand, dame, we have dame, which used to be a 1950s rude way of referring to women. Ain't Nothing Like a Dame is a song from an old musical. The diminutive of that is damsel. And of course we have a University of Notre Dame, which we say Notre Dame, which means Our Lady, the lady there being, of course, Mary, Blessed Virgin Mary. So we have these words in English, but they're not the words that we use to refer to the man and the woman who are in charge of a castle or an abbey. Downton Abbey, of course, is run by who? Waiting for those fans of you out there to conjure the names. Lord and Lady Grantham. Why, this word story asks, do we say Lord and Lady Grantham and not Master and Dame Grantham? And of course, in England, they do use dame as well in another sense. The equivalent of being knighted for a woman is to become a dame. It's Dame Judi Dench, the famous Shakespearean actor and James Bond actor. So where do Lord and Lady come from? The origin of these words in the Germanic languages illustrates that consonant cluster reduction I was just telling you about. Lord, get ready for it. The original form in early Old English was hlafweard. That's hlafweard. It's a compound word beginning with an HL, and it's a compound of the word hlaf, which means loaf, and weard, which is a word we've seen before. Think about Cadman. Cadman refers to God as Heovon Reach is Weard, the warden or guardian of the heaven kingdom, and Monkun is Weard, the warden of mankind. Well, now we've got another warden, another guard, a third Weard. This one, however, is a loaf guardian. That's right, the word Lord comes from loaf guardian. So if someone says my Lord in a castle, or dear Lord in prayer, they're saying, dear loaf guardian. We can also watch this word develop over time. In later Old English, that sound reduction of HL has taken place, and now it just begins with L. And that F to the W has kind of gotten mixed up together, and the F has swallowed the W. The vowels, you always play spin the vowels, they don't stay the same. And you have Lord, and we're marching on toward Lord. And in early Middle English, that becomes something like Lord. And by late Middle English, we have Lord. Loaf guardian to Lord. Well, doesn't that just make you want to know where lady comes from? What's her role in it? If the feudal lord guards the loaf, you might be able to use your sense of patriarchal Western history to figure out what the woman is doing with the loaf. The Old English word for lady is, and here you've got to pull out your Old English pronunciation. Now look at that G. It has two front vowels, E and A, around it, and so it's fronted to a ya. So that is hlafdia. Yes, doesn't sound very dignified or ladylike, does it? What exactly is a hlafdia? What is it to dia, the hlaf? It means loaf kneader, the person who kneads the dough to make the bread. And we can also watch this word grow towards its current form. By late Old English, again with sound simplification, the H is gone, and we have an F, which would have been pronounced probably as a V because it's between two voice sounds, the A and the D. And we probably have lavdi. And the D, with that fronted G has just been replaced by an I. Lavdi. By early Middle English, the F or V sound is gone, and by late Middle English we have lady. It would have been pronounced ladi, but it looks exactly like we would write it today. So by about the year 1400, lord and lady have arrived in their modern forms, whereas 600-800 years before that they were hlafweard and hlafdia. So, to conclude today's lecture, may I present Lofguardian and Lofneder Grantham, hlafweard and hlafdia. Oh dear, Lady Grantham is downstairs cooking. Do you know who's not going to be happy about that? Mrs. Patmore. Heh, I'm Chleachian. Are you Chleachian?